Richard Lawson heard something impossible. Laughter. Real laughter echoing through the marble halls of his silent mansion. His son Marcus hadn't laughed in 8 months, not since the accident that stole his ability to walk. Richard's heart pounded as he raced up the grand staircase, his mind spinning with fear and fury. Someone had broken into his home. Someone was in his son's room. He burst through the door ready to destroy whoever dared invade their sanctuary of grief. But what he saw froze every word in his throat. A barefoot girl in clothes that barely held together spun across the floor like she was dancing on air itself, and Marcus, his broken, hopeless Marcus, was laughing so hard tears streamed down his face. In that single heartbeat, Richard Lawson's entire world cracked open. Welcome to Stories by Jason. If you're settled in and ready for a good story, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I've got another exciting story coming your way tomorrow, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Now let's dive in. The Lawson mansion sat like a beautiful corpse on the hillside overlooking the city. Once, these halls had echoed with life, birthday parties, holiday gatherings, Marcus's infectious laughter racing through every room. Now, silence wrapped around the estate like a funeral shroud. The chandeliers still gleamed. The gardens still bloomed. But inside, grief had murdered joy and left only its ghost. Richard Lawson sat in the leather chair beside his son's bed, watching Marcus stare at nothing. The boy was 10 years old. He should have been running, climbing, destroying things the way boys do. Instead, he sat motionless in his wheelchair, his legs covered by a blanket, his eyes empty of the light that once made him remarkable. 8 months. 8 months since the accident. 8 months since Richard's world shattered into pieces too small to ever fit back together. The doctors had used words like severe spinal trauma, and permanent paralysis, and minimal chance of recovery. Richard had fired 3 of them for their honesty before accepting the truth himself. His son, his only child, his entire reason for existing, would never walk again. Richard had thrown everything at the problem. The best specialists, experimental treatments, therapies from around the world. Nothing worked. Marcus grew quieter with each passing week, retreating deeper into a shell of sadness that Richard couldn't crack no matter how hard he tried. The staff moved through the mansion like shadows, speaking in whispers, careful not to disturb the fragile atmosphere. The house that had once been filled with music now felt like a mausoleum. Even Amanda, Richard's sister who visited weekly, had stopped trying to bring cheer. There was no cheer left to bring. Richard rubbed his face, exhaustion soaking through his bones. "I'm going to my study for a while," he said softly, though Marcus didn't respond. "Call if you need anything." Marcus said nothing. He rarely spoke anymore. Richard closed the door behind him and descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. His billions meant nothing. His business empire meant nothing. The man who could buy anything in the world couldn't buy his son's smile. Miles away, on the broken streets of the Riverside district, a different kind of suffering played out in the cold. Velma Lucas crouched against a brick wall, her thin arms wrapped around her knees, trying to stay warm. She was 12 years old, though hunger and hardship made her look younger. Her clothes were torn in places she tried to patch with thread she'd found in dumpsters. Her shoes, if you could call them that, were held together with tape and hope. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. A woman at the corner store had given her half a sandwich, and Velma had made it last as long as possible. Her stomach ached constantly now. She barely noticed anymore. Velma had learned to survive by being invisible. She slept in abandoned buildings, avoided the police, and danced on street corners for spare change when she was desperate enough. Dancing was the only thing that made her feel human. When she moved to music, any music, even music she imagined in her head, she wasn't homeless or hungry or afraid. She was free. Tonight, she'd wandered farther than usual, drawn by the warm glow of lights coming from the wealthy neighborhood on the hill. She knew she didn't belong there. Poor kids from Riverside learned early to stay away from places like that. But the cold was biting tonight, and Velma was tired of being cold. She approached the massive Lawson estate with cautious curiosity. The gates were enormous, the walls high, but she noticed something the security team had missed: a gap in the service entrance where the fence didn't quite meet the wall. It was small, but Velma was smaller. She slipped through without thinking, drawn by warmth and light and something she couldn't name. Just for a few minutes, she told herself. Just to feel what it's like to be warm. The mansion was even more beautiful up close. Velma moved like a ghost through the shadows, past the gardens, toward a side door that had been left unlocked. Her heart hammered in her chest. She knew this was wrong. She knew she could get in terrible trouble. But the cold pushed her forward, and the warm air that drifted from inside pulled her like a magnet. She found herself in a hallway lined with paintings. Everything was so clean, so perfect. She'd never seen anything like it. She moved quietly, carefully, not touching anything, just looking. Then she heard it. A soft, sad sound. Crying? No, not crying. Breathing. Lonely breathing. Velma followed the sound to a partially open door and peeked inside. A boy sat in a wheelchair near the window, alone. He looked about her age, maybe younger. His face was turned toward the glass, but she could see the sadness etched into his features. He looked the way Velma felt most days, like someone who'd forgotten how to hope. Something inside Velma's chest twisted. She recognized that look. She shouldn't go in. She should leave. She should run before someone found her. But her feet moved anyway. Marcus didn't notice her at first. He was lost in his own darkness. Then he heard a sound, soft footsteps, and turned his head. A girl stood in his room. A thin, ragged girl with tangled hair and clothes that looked like they'd been worn for months. She stared at him with wide eyes, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "I'm sorry," Velma whispered. "I didn't mean to, I should go." But Marcus did something that surprised them both. He smiled. Just a little. The first real smile he'd given anyone in months. "Don't go," he said quietly. His voice was rusty from disuse. "Please." Velma hesitated. The boy looked so alone. So sad. Just like her. "I won't hurt anything," she promised. I was cold." "It's okay," Marcus said. "I'm Marcus." "Velma." They looked at each other, two broken kids finding something familiar in each other's brokenness. Then, without planning it, without thinking, Velma did the only thing she knew how to do when sadness felt too heavy. She started to dance. It was clumsy at first. There was no music except the rhythm in her head. Her movements were awkward, unpracticed, raw. But there was something in the way she moved, something pure and alive and completely free, that cut through the dead air of the mansion like light through darkness. Marcus watched, mesmerized. Velma spun slowly, then faster. She lifted her arms. She moved across the floor like she was painting joy in the air itself. And for the first time in 8 months, Marcus felt something other than despair. He laughed. It started small, just a chuckle, but then it grew. A real laugh. A sound that belonged to the boy he used to be. Velma grinned and danced harder, encouraged by his reaction. She leaped. She twirled. She moved like someone who had nothing to lose because she truly had nothing to lose. And Marcus laughed until tears ran down his face. Downstairs, Richard was reviewing contracts in his study when he heard it. Laughter. His son's laughter. He froze, pen hovering over paper, not trusting his ears. It had been so long since he'd heard that sound that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating. Then he heard it again. Louder. Richard dropped everything and ran. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart slamming against his ribs. Fear and hope tangled in his chest. Something was happening. Something had changed. He reached Marcus's door and threw it open, ready to confront whoever or whatever had invaded his home. The scene before him made no sense. A homeless girl, barefoot, dressed in rags, impossibly thin, was dancing wildly in the middle of his son's room. And Marcus was watching her with shining eyes, laughing harder than Richard had heard since before the accident. Richard's first instinct was fury. Someone had broken into his house. Someone unauthorized was near his vulnerable son. He opened his mouth to shout, to call security, to end this immediately. But then he saw something that stopped every word in his throat. Marcus's fingers were moving. Not much. Just small twitches. but they were moving. His shoulders had straightened slightly. His posture had changed. And his face, God, his face, was alive again. The girl noticed Richard and froze mid-spin, terror flooding her features. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I didn't mean, I'll go." "No," Marcus said suddenly, urgently. "Dad, please don't send her away. Please." Richard stood motionless in the doorway, his mind trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. This made no sense. None of this made any sense. But his son was smiling. His son was laughing. His son was moving. Richard's voice came out barely above a whisper, shaking with something he couldn't name. "Do that again." Velma stared at him, confused and frightened. "Dance," Richard said, louder this time. "Please. Do that again." And in that impossible moment, as the homeless girl began to move once more and his son's laughter filled the dead mansion with life, Richard Lawson understood that something miraculous had just walked into his world wearing torn shoes and carrying nothing but joy. Everything was about to change. Velma danced again, though her movements were hesitant now, self-conscious under Richard's intense gaze. But Marcus watched her with such desperate hope that she forced herself to continue, spinning slowly, lifting her arms, letting the invisible music guide her feet. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, his analytical mind trying to make sense of what defied all logic. Marcus's fingers twitched again. His shoulders rolled slightly forward. Small movements, barely noticeable but real. Undeniably real. When Velma finally stopped, breathless and trembling, the room fell silent except for Marcus's soft laughter. "Who are you?" Richard's voice was controlled, but Velma heard the edge beneath it. "How did you get into my house?" Velma's eyes darted toward the door, calculating escape routes. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean any harm. I was cold and I saw the lights and I found a gap in the fence by the side gate. I shouldn't have come inside. I know that. But then I heard." She glanced at Marcus. "I heard him breathing. He sounded so sad. Like me. Like you." Richard's eyebrows rose. "Lonely," Velma said quietly. "I know what loneliness sounds like." Richard studied her, the torn clothes, the dirt under her fingernails, the way she held herself like someone used to running. "You're homeless." It wasn't a question, but Velma nodded anyway. "And you broke into my home to dance for my son?" "I didn't plan it," Velma said quickly. When I saw him looking so sad, I wanted to help. Dancing is the only thing I have that makes people smile. I do it on street corners sometimes for money, but I wasn't trying to steal anything, I swear. I just wanted to make him happy." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Richard looked at Marcus, whose expression had transformed from desperate hope to quiet pleading. "Dad, please," Marcus whispered. "Don't make her leave. Please." Richard's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to call security, to get this stranger away from his vulnerable son, to restore order and control. But he couldn't ignore what he'd witnessed. In 5 minutes, this homeless girl had accomplished what months of expensive therapy had failed to achieve. She'd made Marcus laugh. She'd made him move. "What's your name?" Richard asked. "Velma. Velma Lucas." "Velma." Richard crossed his arms, still processing. "I need you to understand something. My son is fragile. He's been through hell. If you're here to take advantage of him, to scam us." "I'm not," Velma interrupted, then immediately looked terrified at her own boldness. "I'm sorry for interrupting, sir, but I promise I'm not here to hurt anyone. I didn't even know anyone rich lived here. I wanted to be warm for a few minutes." Richard studied her face, searching for deception. He found none. Just fear, exhaustion, and something else. A fierce protectiveness when she looked at Marcus that reminded Richard of himself. "Stay," he said abruptly. "For a few more minutes. Dance for him again." Velma blinked in surprise. "Really? If you're willing." Velma glanced at Marcus, who nodded eagerly, and a small smile broke across her face. "Okay, yes." This time, she danced with more confidence. She moved across the room like water, fluid and unpredictable, her thin arms creating shapes in the air. She hummed softly, a melody Richard didn't recognize but that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. And Marcus responded. His fingers didn't just twitch, they flexed. His shoulders rolled more deliberately. He leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair, his core muscles engaging in ways Richard hadn't seen since before the accident. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He pulled out his phone and began recording, needing evidence of what he was seeing because he knew no one would believe him otherwise. When Velma finished, Marcus was breathing hard, exhausted but glowing with something Richard had thought was lost forever: joy. "That was amazing," Marcus said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "You're amazing." Velma's cheeks flushed. "You really think so?" "I know so." Richard cleared his throat, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Velma, I need you to leave now, but—" Velma's face fell. "But I want you to come back tomorrow," Richard continued quickly. "Same time. Can you do that?" Velma stared at him, disbelief written across her features. "You want me to come back?" "I do." "Will you?" "Yes," Velma said immediately. "Yes, I'll come back." "Use the front door this time," Richard said. "I'll inform security. They'll let you in." The next day, Velma arrived at exactly 4 o'clock, clean but still wearing the same torn clothes. Richard had her escorted to Marcus's room, where his son was already waiting, practically vibrating with excitement. "You came back," Marcus said. "I promised I would." And she danced again. Different movements this time, more playful, more energetic. Marcus laughed until his sides hurt, and his arms twitched with visible effort as he tried to copy her gestures. That evening, when Marcus's physical therapist came for the daily session, she noticed something unusual. "His muscle engagement is different today," she said, frowning at her notes. "His core strength has improved. Have you changed anything in his routine?" Richard said nothing, but he scheduled an appointment with Marcus's neurologist for the following week. The next day, Velma came again. And the day after that. And the day after that. By the end of the first week, a pattern had formed. Velma would arrive at 4, dance for Marcus for an hour, and Richard would watch from the doorway, documenting every small improvement, every moment of progress that shouldn't be possible. During the second week, Richard began asking Velma questions. Where did she sleep? What did she? How had she ended up alone? Velma's answers were heartbreaking. She lived in an abandoned building in the Riverside district with her sick grandmother. They survived on whatever food she could find or earn. She'd been dancing on streets since she was 8 years old. Her grandmother could barely walk anymore, and they had nothing. No family, no money, no help. Richard listened, his heart hardening with resolve. The next day, when Velma arrived, Richard had the kitchen staff prepare a full meal for her. She stared at the plate of hot food like it was made of gold. "For me," she whispered. "Eat," Richard said gently. "Please." Velma ate slowly, savoring every bite, tears streaming silently down her face. Richard also had fresh clothes waiting for her, simple but clean, properly sized. And a warm coat for the cold nights. Velma cried when she saw them, overwhelmed by kindness she'd never experienced. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked. Richard looked at Marcus, who was watching Velma with pure adoration. "Because you gave us something we thought we'd lost forever," Richard said quietly. "You gave us hope." The staff noticed the changes too. The mansion felt different, warmer, somehow. Music drifted through the halls again. Marcus's laughter echoed in the corridors. Even Richard seemed lighter, less haunted by the weight of grief that had nearly crushed him. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, mentioned it during the weekly staff meeting. "It's like the house is breathing again," she said. "That little girl is a miracle." She wasn't wrong. By the third week, Marcus's improvements were undeniable. He could hold a cup without dropping it. He could sit up straighter without assistance. His therapists were baffled but couldn't argue with the results. And through it all, Velma danced. She created new routines for Marcus, incorporating movements he could try to copy. She sang softly while she danced, her voice thin but sweet. She made him laugh with silly faces and exaggerated gestures. She treated him not like someone broken, but like someone whole. One afternoon, during a particularly energetic routine, something extraordinary happened. Velma was spinning across the floor, her arms extended, when Marcus, focused with fierce determination, lifted his right arm higher than he had since the accident. Not just a twitch or a flex, but a deliberate, controlled lift that brought his hand almost to shoulder height. The movement lasted only a few seconds before his arm dropped back down, trembling with exhaustion. But it happened. Richard stood from his chair, his hands shaking. Marcus stared at his own arm in wonder. And Velma stopped dancing, her eyes wide with realization. "You did it," she whispered. "Marcus, you did it." Marcus looked at her, then at his father, and smiled wider than the sun. "I did," he said, his voice filled with awe. "I actually did." Richard crossed the room and knelt beside his son's wheelchair, pulling Marcus into a fierce hug. "You're getting stronger," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're really getting stronger." When he looked up at Velma, standing awkwardly to the side with her hands clasped together, he saw not just a homeless girl who'd wandered into their lives by accident. He saw family. "Thank you," Richard said to her. "Velma, thank you." Velma smiled through her tears. "I'll keep dancing for him," she promised. "As long as he wants me to, I'll keep dancing." And in that moment, Richard made a decision that would change all of their lives. This girl wasn't going back to the streets. Not today. Not ever. She just didn't know it yet. Marcus woke every morning with the same question on his lips. When is Velma coming? It became his anchor, his reason to push through the painful therapy sessions and the endless exercises that had once felt pointless. Now they had purpose. He wanted to be stronger for her, to show her that her dancing wasn't just entertainment, it was medicine. Velma arrived like clockwork at 4 each afternoon, but soon Richard noticed her lingering near the gates earlier and earlier, as though being away from Marcus was physically painful. So he changed the arrangement. She could come at noon, stay for lunch, spend the afternoon with Marcus, and leave after dinner if she wished. Velma accepted with tears of gratitude. She began creating routines specifically designed for Marcus to follow. Simple movements at first, finger waves, wrist rotations, shoulder rolls. She'd demonstrate each motion slowly, exaggerating the movements, making them playful and fun rather than clinical. Marcus would watch with fierce concentration, then attempt to copy her, his face tight with effort. "That's it." Velma would cheer when his fingers managed a full curl. "You're doing it, Marcus. You're so strong." And Marcus would glow under her praise in ways he never did with his therapists. Richard watched these sessions from his usual spot in the doorway, and something fundamental shifted inside him. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't about finding the best doctors or the most cutting-edge treatments. It was about connection, about joy, about a homeless girl who had nothing giving his son everything that mattered. He became fiercely protective of Velma. When she mentioned her grandmother's worsening condition, Richard dispatched a private doctor to the Riverside district within hours. When Velma arrived one morning with bruises from sleeping on concrete, Richard had a bed delivered to the abandoned building she called home. He did these things quietly, without fanfare, because he understood that Velma's pride was as important as her safety. But secrets don't stay buried in wealthy circles. Word began spreading among the household staff, then to Richard's business associates, then to the wider social network that defined high society. The billionaire Richard Lawson was allowing a homeless street girl unrestricted access to his disabled son. The whispers started as curiosity, then evolved into judgment. "Have you heard about Richard Lawson?" someone said at the country club. "Letting that dirty child into his home? What's he thinking? It's either charity theater or he's lost his mind with grief. That poor boy. First the accident, now this." Some praised Richard's compassion. Most questioned his judgment. A few suggested he was being scammed, that the girl's story was manufactured, that she was after his fortune. The criticism reached Richard through well-meaning friends who thought they were protecting him. He listened politely, then ignored every word. What did their opinions matter when Marcus was laughing again? When his son was showing improvement that medical science couldn't explain? Richard's focus remained singular: Marcus's healing. And healing was exactly what was happening. 1 month after Velma first danced into their lives, Marcus achieved something his doctors had deemed impossible. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Velma was performing a routine she'd choreographed to one of Marcus's favorite songs, something upbeat and joyful that made him tap his fingers against the wheelchair arms in rhythm. She spun, leaped, and extended her arms in a dramatic flourish, encouraging Marcus to reach upward with her. Marcus lifted both arms as high as he could, trembling with effort. Then, his face set with determination, he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair and pushed. His body rose. Not much. Just a few inches. His legs still hung uselessly, but his upper body lifted from the seat, suspended in space for 3 impossible seconds before he collapsed back down, gasping and laughing simultaneously. The room exploded with emotion. "Marcus!" Velma screamed, rushing toward him. "You did it! You lifted yourself! Oh my God, you actually—" Richard couldn't move. He stood frozen in the doorway, watching his son, his paralyzed son, do something every specialist had said would never happen. Tears poured down his face unchecked, his composure shattered completely. Marcus looked from Velma to his father, his eyes shining with disbelief and triumph. "Did you see that, Dad? Did you see?" Richard crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside the wheelchair, pulling Marcus into his arms. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, years of grief and hopelessness pouring out in that single embrace. Velma stood nearby, suddenly panicked. "Did I hurt him? Oh no, did I push him too hard? I'm so sorry, I didn't mean." Richard released Marcus and reached for Velma, pulling her into the embrace as well. "You didn't hurt him," he said, his voice breaking. "Velma, you saved him. You're saving both of us." Velma clung to them, crying now too, and for a moment the 3 of them existed in a bubble of pure, unfiltered joy. From that day forward, something shifted in their dynamic. They stopped being a billionaire, his son, and a homeless girl who helped them. They became something deeper, something that transcended class and circumstance and logic. They became a family. Marcus and Velma developed their own language of inside jokes and shared games. They played cards together, with Velma making up ridiculous rules that made Marcus laugh until he couldn't breathe. They told each other stories. Marcus about his life before the accident, Velma about her adventures surviving on the streets, both of them creating a shared narrative that belonged to them alone. Richard would find them sometimes with their heads bent together, whispering and giggling, and his heart would swell with an emotion he thought he'd lost forever. Not romantic love or even the same kind of love he felt for Marcus, but something equally powerful, the love of found family, of chosen connection, of people who needed each other in ways that went beyond blood. He caught himself referring to Velma as "my daughter" in conversations with staff. At first, he corrected himself. Then he stopped correcting. The title felt right. The mansion transformed around them. Music played constantly. Laughter echoed through hallways that had been silent for too long. The staff smiled more. Even Mrs. Patterson, who'd been skeptical at first, admitted that Velma had brought life back to a house that had been dying. "She's special, that one," Mrs. Patterson told Richard one evening. "Whatever magic she carries, Mr. Lawson, don't let it go." Richard had no intention of letting it go. 6 weeks after Velma first entered their lives, Richard sat with both children in Marcus's room, watching them play a game Velma had invented involving imaginary characters and elaborate storylines. Marcus was fully engaged, his arms moving more freely than they had since the accident, his laughter genuine and unforced. Richard realized with startling clarity that he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this content. As the evening wound down and Velma prepared to leave, Richard still insisted on having her driven safely home each night. Marcus reached for her hand. "Velma?" His voice was serious, thoughtful. "Yeah. Do you think?" Marcus hesitated, vulnerability flickering across his face. "Do you think you could help me stand one day? Not just lift myself. Actually stand?" The room fell silent. Richard held his breath, knowing how much courage it took for Marcus to voice that dream aloud. Velma knelt beside the wheelchair and took both of Marcus's hands in hers, her expression fierce with conviction. "Marcus, I will never stop helping you," she said firmly. "Not until you stand. Not until you walk." Not until you run if that's what you want. I promise you I will never ever stop. Marcus smiled, and in his eyes was a faith that transcended medicine and science and logic. Okay, he said simply. Then I'll do it. We'll do it together. Richard watched them, these two extraordinary children who'd found each other across impossible divides, and knew with absolute certainty that the real miracle wasn't Marcus's physical recovery. The real miracle was this: two broken souls healing each other through nothing more than kindness, hope, and the stubborn belief that love could conquer anything, even the impossible. The sessions intensified over the following weeks. Velma arrived earlier each day, staying longer, pouring everything she had into creating movements that would challenge Marcus without overwhelming him. And Marcus responded with a determination that bordered on obsession. "Watch my legs," he'd say during each session, his eyes fixed on his motionless limbs. "Tell me if you see anything. Anything at all." At first, there was nothing. Then barely perceptible twitches. A toe flexing. A knee shifting a fraction of an inch. Movements so small they might have been imagination, except Velma saw them too, and she dropped to her knees beside the wheelchair, her hands hovering over his legs as if she could will them back to life through proximity alone. "I saw it, Marcus. Your ankle moved. It really moved." Richard documented everything with the meticulousness of a scientist, but even he struggled to explain what was happening. The medical team he'd assembled, neurologists, physical therapists, specialists from 3 countries, examined Marcus weekly, and their confusion was evident in every report. "The spinal injury hasn't changed," Dr. Morrison said, frowning at the latest scans. "The damage is still there. But somehow, his nervous system is finding new pathways, creating connections that shouldn't be possible. I've never seen anything like it." "What's causing it?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Morrison glanced toward the doorway where Velma was making Marcus laugh with an exaggerated dance move. "I don't know, Mr. Lawson. But whatever that young lady is doing, don't stop her." Richard had no intention of stopping. If anything, he gave Velma more freedom, more resources, more encouragement. He converted one of the mansion's large sitting rooms into a proper dance studio with mirrors, a sound system, and enough space for Velma to create elaborate routines. The household staff, once wary of the strange homeless girl who'd infiltrated their world, now treated Velma like royalty. Mrs. Patterson baked her favorite cookies. The groundskeeper taught her the names of flowers in the garden. The security team smiled and waved when she arrived each day. "She's one of us now," the head of security told Richard. "Anyone tries to hurt that girl, they'll have to go through every person in this house." Richard felt the same fierce protectiveness, multiplied tenfold. It was a Wednesday morning, exactly 2 months after Velma first danced into their lives, when the impossible became real. Marcus had been practicing a new routine, one that required significant upper body engagement. Velma danced in front of him, her movements precise and encouraging, while Marcus gripped the wheelchair arms and tried to follow her rhythm. "Feel the music in your chest," Velma was saying. "Let it move through you. Don't think, just feel." Marcus closed his eyes, swaying slightly. His breathing deepened. His fingers tightened on the armrests. Then, without warning, he pushed. His arms straightened. His shoulders lifted. His entire upper body rose from the wheelchair, and this time, his legs came with him. Not just a slight lift. Marcus rose until he was standing, his full weight supported on trembling legs that hadn't held him in nearly a year. Time stopped. Velma's mouth opened in a silent scream, her eyes impossibly wide. Richard, who'd been reviewing documents across the room, dropped everything and stared in frozen disbelief. Marcus stood there for 5 eternal seconds, shaking violently, his face twisted with effort and shock and overwhelming joy. Then his legs gave out and he collapsed back into the wheelchair, gasping for air. The spell broke. "Marcus!" Velma shrieked, rushing to him. "You stood. You actually stood. Oh my God, you were standing." Richard's legs gave out. He literally fell to his knees on the floor, his hands covering his face, sobs tearing from his chest with a force that shook his entire body. All the grief, all the hopelessness, all the months of watching his son fade away, It poured out of him in waves of emotion so intense he couldn't breathe. Marcus was crying too, laughing and crying simultaneously, his arms wrapped around Velma, who had climbed halfway into his lap to hug him. "I did it. Velma, I stood. Did you see? Did Dad see?" "I saw," Richard choked out, crawling across the floor to reach them. He pulled both children into his arms, holding them so tightly they could barely breathe. "I saw everything. Marcus, you were standing. You were actually standing." They stayed like that for a long time, 3 people wound together, crying and laughing and celebrating a miracle that defied every medical prediction. When they finally separated, Richard called Dr. Morrison immediately. The entire medical team arrived within hours, running tests, taking measurements, documenting everything with the stunned expressions of people watching their understanding of medicine dissolve before their eyes. "This shouldn't be possible," Dr. Morrison kept repeating. "The injury pattern, the severity, the timeline, none of this makes sense." "But it happened," Richard said firmly. "You'll see it happen again. This is just the beginning." He was right. Over the next week, Marcus stood 3 more times, each instance lasting longer than the last. His legs were weak, his balance non-existent, but the foundation was there. The impossible had become possible. That Saturday evening, after Marcus had been settled in bed exhausted but glowing with accomplishment, Richard asked Velma to join him in his study. She entered nervously, still wearing one of the simple dresses Richard had bought her, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked healthier now. The constant meals had filled out her thin frame, and sleep in actual beds had erased the shadows under her eyes. But she still carried herself with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust good things. "Am I in trouble?" she asked quietly. "No, sweetheart. Not at all." Richard gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit please. I need to talk to you about something important." Velma perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Richard studied her for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Velma, you've been coming here for 2 months now. In that time, you've changed everything. You've changed Marcus. You've changed this house. You've changed me." Velma said nothing, confusion flickering across her face. "What I'm trying to say is—" Richard leaned forward, his expression intense. "You're not just a visitor anymore. You're not someone who helps us and then leaves. You're part of this family. And I want to make that official." "Official?" Velma whispered. "I want you to live here, Velma. Permanently. I want to give you a home, a real home, with your own room and everything you need. I want to enroll you in school, make sure you're educated and safe, and have every opportunity you deserve." Richard's voice grew thick with emotion. "I want to be the father you haven't had. I want Marcus to be the brother you never had. I want us to be your family." Velma stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why would you want me? I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I don't have anything to give you." "You gave us everything," Richard said fiercely. "You gave Marcus his life back. You gave me hope when I had none left. You walked into our world with nothing but joy in your heart, and you saved us. Both of us. But I'm from the streets. I don't know how to be rich. I don't know how—" "I don't care about any of that," Richard interrupted. "I care that you're kind and brave and full of light. I care that Marcus loves you like a sister. I care that when I imagine our future, you're in it. Always." Velma broke down completely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Richard moved around the desk and knelt beside her chair, taking her shaking hands in his. "You deserve this, Velma. You deserve safety and love and a future. Let me give you that. Let us be your family. Please." "Yes," Velma gasped through her tears. "Yes, yes, please, yes." Richard pulled her into his arms and let her cry, his own tears falling silently into her hair. The news broke 3 days later. Somehow, through staff, through business associates, through the invisible network of gossip that powered high society, word spread that billionaire Richard Lawson had officially taken in a homeless girl from the Riverside district. The city exploded with opinions. Local news stations ran stories. Social media lit up with debate. Some praised Richard's compassion, calling him a hero. a beacon of hope, proof that wealth could be used for good. Others were less kind. They questioned his motives, suggested the girl was a scam artist, implied inappropriateness, accused him of publicity stunts and savior complexes. Richard's phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews, friends offering unsolicited advice, critics demanding explanations. He ignored all of it. The only opinions that mattered were in his house. Marcus was thriving, practicing standing multiple times a day, setting new goals with Velma's encouragement. And Velma was blossoming like a flower finally given sunlight and water. She smiled constantly. She laughed freely. She belonged. One evening, as Richard passed Velma's new bedroom, the one Marcus had insisted be right next to his, he overheard her talking to herself in the mirror. "You have a home," she was whispering, her voice full of wonder. "You have a family. You have a home." Richard knocked softly, and Velma turned, startled. "Everything okay?" he asked. Velma's smile was radiant. "Everything's perfect. I was just reminding myself this is real." Richard crossed the room and placed his hands gently on her shoulders, meeting her eyes in the mirror's reflection. "This is real, Velma. You're not going anywhere. You're not a guest. You're not temporary." His voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "You belong here." Velma turned and hugged him tightly, and Richard held his daughter, because that's what she was now, in every way that mattered, and knew that despite all the noise, all the judgment, all the criticism from the outside world, they had found something precious. They had found each other. And nothing else mattered. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.